Yeah, this has a lot to do with why I went down this rabbit hole instead, though. Before moving on to this brief introduction of some of the most, mastery learning, the nature of an innovation is that it will arise at a fringe where it can afford to become prevalent enough to establish its usefulness without being overwhelmed by the inertia of the orthodox system. Kevin Kelly, co founder of Wired magazine. Before moving on from this brief introduction of some of the bedrock principles and intuitions upon which the Academy's methods were founded as an CAT Academy, I'd like to mention one other important concept that will figure significantly in our story, mastery learning. At its most fundamental, mastery learning simply suggests that students should adequately comprehend a given sub-concept before being expected to understand a more advanced one. While this seems straightforward and common sense, sensical enough, mastery learning has had a rocky and controversial history that is of interest for at least two reasons. First, it constitutes yet another instance of the educational establishment failing to follow up on its best research and somber advice, and soundest advice. Second, because of the advances in technology, it is finally possible, nearly a century after the advances of mastery learning were first described in testing, to broadly apply its methods and techniques to real schools and real students. With a little history, way back in 1919, before there were computers, television, or antibiotics, a progressive educator named Charles W. Welsher Byrne was named superintendent of the schools in the affluent Chicago suburb of Winnetka, Illinois. The time and place were right for innovation. The victory in World War I had boosted morale and helped create an American can-do spirit. Economic times were on the upswing. Winnetka had manageably sized a school system within the will and the means to experiment and excel. In 1922, Washburn introduced what had become widely known as the Winnetka Plan. At its heart was the somewhat radical concept of mastery learning. What made mastery learning radical? Two things. First, it was predicated upon the belief that all students could learn if provided conditions appropriate to their needs. No one should have to be, quote, held back, unquote, or put on a track that leads to academic failure. Second, mastery learning structured its curriculum not in terms of time, but in terms of certain targets of comprehension and achievement. This turned traditional quietly, but entirely upside down. In the traditional model, a certain amount of class time is devoted to, oh god, we just lost our place. In the traditional model, a certain amount of class time is devoted to a particular topic or concept, but when the allotted interval is finished, the entire class moves on, despite of the fact that individual students will have achieved widely varying degrees of mastery over over the material. In Washburn's systems, by contrast, students, with the help of self-paced exercises, proceeded at varying rates towards the same level of mastery. Those who learn more quickly can move ahead or do enrichment exercises. Those who learn more slowly are helped along by individual tutoring or peer assistance or additional homework. Let me emphasize the difference because it's central to everything I argue for in this book. In the traditional academic model, the time allotted to learn something is fixed, where the comprehension of the concept is variable. Washburn was advocating the opposite. What should be fixed is a high level of comprehension, and what should be variable is the amount of time the students have to understand a concept. During the progressive 1920s, the interest in the Winnetka Plan ran high. Self-introduction workbooks were in demand around the country. Charlton Washburn himself became an academic star, going on to serve as the president of the Progressive Education Association and to join the faculty of the Brooklyn College. But then a strange thing happened to the notion of mastery learning. It soon went out of vogue, and for decades, it was all but forgotten. Why? Part of the reason was no doubt was economic. A small, wealthy school system like Renika's could afford new textbooks and exercise tablets and other material required by the system, but the technology of paper publishing was expensive and probably impractical on a nationwide scale. Then too, there was the teacher retraining. Mastery learning did in fact call for a somewhat different set of techniques and skills, which in turn called not only for money, but for initiative and flexibility on the part of teachers and administrators. Largely, though, what killed mastery learning 1920 style seems to have been simple inertia and resistance to new and threatening ideas. In a truly shocking 1989 study, it was scheduled that it was concluded that between 1983 and 1979, instructional practice in public schools remained about the same, and it really hasn't changed from 1979 to 2012 either. To be sure, some of the very innovative groups of teachers in schools have been experimenting with new techniques within their classrooms, but the mainstream model did not change in any appreciable way. Did no one notice how much the world was changing and how much the educational needs of students were evolving as well? In any case, the concept of mastery learning seems to have been smothered under the vast weight of the educational orthodoxy, and it languished until the next progressive era, the 1960s. When it was revived, it was in a slightly different form by the developmental psychologist named Benjamin Bloom and his leading protege, James Block. Bloom and Block suggested refinements in testing methods and delivery of feedback, but their basic principles came straight out of the Winnicott Plan. Students learned at their own pace, advancing to the next concept only after teaching a prescribed degree of mastery over the previous concept. Teachers served primarily as guides and mentors rather than lecturers. Peer interaction was encouraged. Peers helping peers was a benefit not only academically but in character building as well. Some students might struggle, but none were given up on. Mastery learning techniques were soon being applied in various pilot programs around the country, and study after study, mastery learning kicked butt when compared to conventional classroom models. It did a lot better. One research paper concluded that student and mastery learning programs at all levels showed increased gains in achievement over those in traditional instruction programs. Students retained what they learned longer under mastery learning, both in short and long-term studies. Another study found that mastery learning reduces the academic spread between the slower and faster students without slowing down the faster students, shifting the emphasis from students to teachers. Yet study recorded that teachers who used mastery learning began to feel better about teaching and their roles as teachers. Well, with reviews like that, you might have thought it was mastery learning that would be the long running show, but it wasn't. And here, I just wanted to say on Cat Academy, with the latest lesson, the first time I did this, and I went through this, I've got a history now and everything, and I can look at my progress and my activities that I did oh no. Anyways, so starting today at about 10:49, I started on it, but I went in, and I had problems initially with it. See, as you can see, I went and attempted it, the first time, and it took me 6 minutes to do, and I did an absolute terrible job on it, and because I had problems, the first time. So it took me several attempts to get through this at everything, today and everything. But I was beginning so I began, to do this pretty. Dang it, So I was doing. Oh yeah, now I see. So I started, to deal with it. Today, it seems very strange though that it's all over the place, but no, I mean, I guess I'll just, put forward the original, but, at about 9:32, I started on the exam, and, I was just doing terrible at it the first time through it and everything, and so I went back through it again at 9:40 and did it again, and I finally got it right, and, because I was allowed to make a mistake, in studying this, because I was able to, go through that 1 out of 4 and then screw up and then try to think about it and, work on it and try to understand it and ask ChatGPT and, have those mistakes. I was able to actually grasp the concept enough to, now I appear to, Cat Academy to have been, just level, proficient at it. But honestly, I actually am more than proficient at it. I've mastered the concept. I get it now fully. But because I was allowed to make those mistakes, because I was able to fix those mistakes and then think about it and go back into and I stuck with it until it clicked into place and I got it. Reviews like that, you might have thought that mastery learning would be a long running show, but it wasn't. As in the 1920s, the method enjoyed a brief vogue and then was swamped by the stagnant waters of traditional classroom procedures. As before, the reason was partly economic. It still cost money to print and distribute all those workbooks, test forms, and individualized reading materials. But money wasn't the only hurdle. Once again, there was the resistance of administrators, and bureaucrats. Change was difficult. Change was frightening. The old way worked well enough, didn't it? No, it doesn't work well enough. Lacking, in fact, it works abysmally well. I mean, one look at, Portland Community College and Math 65 courses and everything that I saw there on the ground, and I could tell you it doesn't work well enough. As a critique and everything that's aimed squarely at the heart of Portland Community College and everything, but really it's not. Why should they be singled out? They don't do things differently than other universities. I mean, they all do the same thing. I saw 30 desperate kids struggling to understand mathematics and the whole thing, all engaged in everything. All of them were pretty, reasonably engaged with the topic material. They were showing up, they were asking the professor questions, and they were all struggling, How is that working well enough? Everybody's being dragged along, at the same pace, due to the fact that it's moving too fast for almost everybody, Anyways, so it doesn't work well enough, lacking on some clear present urgency to leave the comfort zone of lectures and traditional textbooks. Why bother? And so, in spite of the fact that mastery learning had consistently been demonstrated both anecdotal and statistical benefits for both students and teachers, it went out of fashion again. And I'm having this thought, I've got friends that, did this stuff and got through it, for their programming courses and everything, and their computer science degree, and they learned all this stuff once, and then they promptly forgot it because they never used it out of school. Well, I don't want to be that way. I want to actually retain the knowledge for longer. One research paper concluded that students in mastery learning programs at all levels showed increased gains in achievement over those with traditional instruction programs. Students retained what they learned longer and under mastery learning, both in short and long-term studies. Another study found that mastery learning, we're repeating ourselves. Cut to the present moment, and that human nature hasn't changed. Bureaucrats and organizations still seem to have built an aversion to new ideas and approaches. People in all fields still have the tendency to protect their turf, sometimes at the expense of the greater good. In other regards, however, things are proving quite different this time around. More than ever before, there's a sense of urgency when it comes to educational reform. The old system is failing us. It needs to be rethought. On this, there is broad agreement among the public, The other thing that has changed, and this is huge, is that technology has radically lowered the expenses formerly associated with mastery learning. No more paper workbooks, no more pricey printings of individualized exercise. Everything needed for self-paced learning is right there in the computer. The cost of delivering it to students is minuscule. The old excuse of the newfangled teaching methods are too expensive or are only the province of elite schools and privileged communities just no longer applies. There's one more aspect of mastery learning that I'd like to explore before moving on, the relationship between mastery learning and personal responsibility. Taking responsibility for education, responsibility on the part of students, families, and communities and nations is, of course, a hot-button issue these days, approached and argued from all points on the political compass. Too often, however, the suggestion is made that taking responsibilities is somehow an independent thing from the learning itself, and that responsibility can be put on the shoulders of parents and teachers without necessarily involving the student. Both of these notions are false. Taking responsibility for education, taking responsibility for learning is learning. From the student's perspective, only by taking responsibility does true learning become possible. Studies of mastery learning dynamics make this clear. In one such study, it was observed that students in mastery programs developed more positive attitudes about learning and about their ability to learn. To use a contemporary expression, they were more likely to claim ownership of their education. Another study concluded simply that students who learned under mastery conditions accepted greater responsibility for their learning. And this is really cool, what we're getting in terms of data. I can't believe this. I have to struggle with this, thing. I stress this because I believe that personal responsibility is not only undervalued, but that it actually discouraged by the standard classroom model, with its enforced passivity and rigid boundaries of curricula and time, denied the opportunity to make even the most basic decisions about how and what they will learn. Students stop short of full commitment. Mastery learning, then, is another one of those ideas for which I take no credit whatsoever. Both the concept and the data in support of its effectiveness have been around for quite a while, but as we'll see in due course, the Cat Academy represents an opportunity to apply its principles and reap the benefits far more broadly than ever before. How education happens. Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. Let's consider an incredibly fundamental riddle. How does education happen? I see it as an extremely active, even athletic process. Teachers can convey information, they can insist, they can inspire, and those are important and beautiful things. At the end of the day, however, the fact is that we educate ourselves. We learn first of all by deciding to learn, by committing to learning. Commitment allows in turn for concentration. Concentration pertains not only to the immediate task at hand, but to all the many associations that surround it. All of these processes are active and deeply personal. All involve the acceptance of responsibility. Education doesn't happen out in the ether, and it doesn't happen in an empty space between the teacher's lips and the student's ears. It happens at the individual brain of each of us. This is no mere metaphor, but a physical reality. The Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist Eric R. Kandel, in his seminal book, In Search of Memory, argues that learning is in fact neither more nor less than a series of changes that take place in the individual nerve cells of which our brains are composed. When a given cell is learning, it literally grows. The process is not exactly analogous to what happens when one exercises a muscle, but it's pretty close. Without getting too terribly technical, what happens is that an educated neuron actually develops new synaptic terminals, these being the tiny appendages that across with one's neurons communicate with the next. The increase in the size of the active terminal makes the nerve cell more efficient in passing messages along. As this process is repeated along... As this process is repeated along an entire neural pathway leading up to a particular region of the brain, the information is gathered and stored. As we work with the same concepts from slightly different angles and investigate questions surrounding it, we build a deeper and deeper connections. Collectively, this web of connections and association comprises what we think of as understanding, formally as understanding. In physiological terms, then, learning means that our brains have done some exercise, digested information, connected concepts. God damn it, the way that this scrolls, and memories in new ways, and our nerve cells have thereby been altered. How durable will this new understanding be? That depends in part on how active the learning was acquired in the first place. Again, learning involves physical changes in the brain. Proteins are synthesized, synapses are enhanced. There's a lot of chemical and electrical work going on, and that's why thinking actually burns a lot of calories. The more neurons recruited into the learning process, the more vivid and lasting the memory. The physical changes in the brain, however, are not permanent. What we think of as forgetting is actually the gradual loss or weakening of these extra connections acquired in the process of learning. But there's good news here as well. As Kandel and other researchers have noticed, we don't lose all the extra synapses that we've acquired. Again, an analogy with physical exercise. While inexact is helpful to stop working out for a while, and you will lose some, but not all of the strength that you had acquired. But some of the benefit will remain. This is why it's easier to learn something a second time. At least some of the necessary neural pathways are already there. It's a good incentive to bear down and concentrate the first time around. Oh my god. The findings of Kandel and other neuroscientists have much to say about how we actually learn. Unfortunately, the standard classroom model tends to ignore or to even to fly in the face of these fundamental biological truths. Stressing passivity over activity is one such misstep. Another equally important is the failure of standard education to maximize the brain's capacity for associative learning, the achieving of a deeper comprehensions and more durable memory by relating something newly learned to something already known. Let's take a moment to consider this. Our brains hold two distinctly forms of different kinds of memory, short-term and long-term. Short-term memory is not only fleeting, it's also very fragile as well, easily disrupted by a lapse in concentration or even a momentary detour into a different task or subject. As an everyday example of this, I often forget if I've already used shampoo when I'm in the shower. Long-term memory is far more stable and lasting, though of course not perfectly so. The process by which short-term memory becomes long-term memory, is called consolidation. Brain scientists have yet to discover exactly how consolidation happens at the cellular level, but certain practical functional characteristics of the process are well understood. As Candle writes, for memory to persist, the incoming information must be thoroughly and deeply personal. This is accomplished by attending the information with association and meaningfully and systematically with knowledge already well established in memory. Italics mine. In other words, it's easier to understand and remember something if we can relate it to something else we already know. That's why it's easier to memorize a poem than a series of nonsense syllables of equal length. In a poem, each word relates to images in our mind and to what was come before. There are rules of rhythm and connection that we understand, even if subliminally the poem must follow. Rather than memorizing individual bits of information, we are dealing with patterns and strands of logic that will allow us to come closer to seeing something whole. This seems to be how our brains work best at retaining knowledge for the longer term, and it would certainly seem to suggest that the most effective way to teach would be to emphasize the flow of a subject, the chain of associations that relates one concept to the next and across subjects. Unfortunately, however, the standard approach to classroom teaching does just the opposite. This is obviously seen in the artificial separation of traditional academic subjects. We lop them off at ultimately arbitrary places. We ghettoize them. Genetics is taught in biology, while probability is taught in math, even though one is really an application of the other. Physics is a separate class from algebra, and calculus, despite its direct application of them, chemistry is partitioned off from physics, even though the study of many of the same phenomenon at different levels. All of these divisions limit understanding that would suggest a false picture of how the universe actually works. Wouldn't students find it useful to understand how contact forces studied in physics are in fact an expression of the repulsive forces between electrons studied in chemistry? Wouldn't algebra seem a tad bit more interesting if it could also be used to figure out how fast you'd hit the water on a belly flop, or how heavy you would be on the planet twice Earth's mass? For that matter, think about how the increasing cross-pollination that might occur if a value-neutral subject like computer science were studied together with a value-laden subject like evolution. What might students learn by writing computer programs to simulate variations and competition in such an ecosystem? The possibilities are endless, but they can't be realized given the balkanized habits of our current system. Even without the already sawed-off classes, content is chunked up into standalone episodes and the connections are severed. In algebra, for example, the students are taught to memorize the formula for the vertex of a parable. They separate and memorize the quadratic formula. In yet another lesson, they probably learn to complete the square. In reality, however, all those formulas are expressions of essentially the same mathematical logic that they were taught together as the multiple facets of the same concept. I'm not just nitpicking here. I believe that breaking up of concepts like these has profound and even crucial consequences for how deeply students learn and how well they remember. It's the connection among concepts, or the lack of connections, that separate the students who memorize a formula for an exam only to forget it the next month, and the students who internalize the concepts and are able to apply them when they need them a decade later. The piecemeal approach to teaching can hardly be limited to math and science. Similar instances can be found in humanities. For example, with the subject of history, consider the Napoleonic Wars and the Louisiana Purchase. These were closely related events. Louisiana was offered at the fire sale price only because Napoleon was desperate to finance his land wars in Europe and had his navy destroyed at Trafalgar. He couldn't even protect Louisiana. So he couldn't protect Louisiana even if he wanted to keep it. But what are the kids taught? If they're American, they tend to be taught that Thomas Jefferson got a great deal with very little context as to why the Americans had a lot more negotiation leverage than Napoleon. These facts do nothing to promote an accurate understanding of how interconnected the world was and continues to be to this very day. In our misplaced zeal for tidy categories and teaching modules that fit neatly into the given length of a class time, we deny the students that benefit, the physiological benefit of recognizing connections. The conventional education approach appears to be drearily consistent. Take a piece of a subject and treat it as if it existed in a vacuum. Spend 1 or 3 weeks or 6 weeks of classroom lectures on it, then give the test and move on. No wonder so many students acknowledge that they largely forget a subject soon after they've been tested on it. So why shouldn't they forget? First of all, it's likely that they've been denied the network advantage of having the most recent module related to subjects that have come before it, or their existing life experience. Second, chances are that the students have not been given a sufficient appreciation of how mastery of this topic will lead to a deeper understanding of the things that come after. In short, if a given subject has been sealed, wrapped, and tied up with a bow, if the message is that the subject is finished, why bother to remember it? In gradually developing my own approach to teaching, one of my central objectives was to reverse this balkanizing tendency. In my view, no subject is ever finished, no concept is sealed off from other concept, knowledge is continuous, and ideas flow. An example of this is that we at the Khan Academy call the knowledge map. By 2006, when I was tutoring my cousins and a handful of family members, I had made about 60 question generators for various concepts, and I was beginning to have a hard time keeping track of my tutees' individual progress through the series. I'd already been drawing certain structures on paper to illustrate what are prerequisites for others, so I decided to write some software that would thread these together. Wow. That would thread together and automatically assign new exercises. It looked kind of cool once I had done the first pass, and I thought my cousins might enjoy seeing the map of all the concepts in the system. It was a big hit with them, and it became a core piece of Khan Academy's software platform. In stressing the connections among subjects and giving learners a visual pictures of where they had been and where they're going, we hope to encourage students to follow their own paths, to move actively up, down, and sideways wherever their imaginations lead. This is admittedly by a rather circuitous path, brings us back to the issue of personal responsibility. Given that learning involves physical changes in each of our individual brains, and given that knowledge consists of some linear progression, but rather the gradually deepening in comprehension across a vast concepts of ideas, a surprising corollary prevents itself. No two educations are the same. There's a very refreshing irony here. You can standardize curricula, but you can't standardize learning. No two brains are the same. No two pathways through the infinitely subtle web of knowledge are the same. Even the most rigorous standardized tests demonstrate only an approximate grasp of a certain subset of ideas that each student understands in his or her own way. Personal responsibility for learning goes hand in hand with the recognition of the uniqueness of each learner. Filling in the gaps. Do you wish to be great? Then begin by being. Do you desire to construct the vast or lofty fabric? Think first about the foundations of humility. The higher your structure is, the deeper it must be to be its foundation. There's no such thing as a perfect learner. There's no such thing as a student who gets every subject the first time through. In fact, most of the very brightest people I know enjoy revising basic ideas and seeing the even deeper layers, fully realizing that they might never fully get most things. Even if there were someone with the potential to get everything, she would have extraordinarily good luck to have nothing but excellent resources and teachers, to have gotten through her school years without being home with the flu, and to be improbably level in her focus and in her moods. In the real world, however, this just doesn't happen. Every student, no matter how bright or motivated, struggles now and then. Every student, even my cousin Nadia, is occasionally confused. Every student forgets things, or by a combination of faulty teaching methods and human limitations, fails to grasp some crucial concepts and connections. This less than tidy reality raises a number of questions. How can the inevitable gaps be repaired, and lapses be repaired? If so, how? Who bears the responsibility for recognizing the misconception and stumbling places, and for putting in the time and effort to fix them? I firmly believe that gaps in learning can be repaired. Moreover, they must be repaired if future, more advanced concepts are to be mastered. Subjects evolve from another. One subject's climax is the starting point for a next. A gap of misconceptions in a previous subject, therefore, becomes a stumbling block in one that follows. But there's good news in this as well. We've noted our brains seem to work most efficiently when aided by associations, by links. When a link is missing, say, for example, if we don't quite understand how simple division evolves into long division, we ourselves can often identify the source of the difficulty. To suggest the seemingly obvious how of fixing gaps unless is go back and revisit it until the concept makes more sense. Better still, try to actively apply the concept in a new context. Since neuroscience confirms our intuitive understanding that things are more easily learned the second time through, the review should not be onerous. Further, since repetition is an essential part of learning, a physical part of learning, it is the creation and strengthening of neural pathways, and the revisiting of a subject should result in a deeper and more durable grasp of it. Anyways, that was absolutely beautiful, and I am done reading to you. You know, as to what book this was that I am reading, you know, and I was on page 52. If you want to pursue it for yourself, The One World Schoolhouse, Education Reimagined, Salman Khan. Salman Khan, you just associated a lot of things that I didn't realize, even in the humanities, like you connecting the fact that Napoleon, you know, was desperate and everything, and that's why, you know, the Americans had the greater purchasing power and negotiating power at the bargaining table. You know, and in that context, you know, connecting all that together. Thank you. You know, I never thought, you know, you provide an interesting perspective on history, to say the least. You know, you've brought up aspects of it that I would not have connected together. Thank you. You know, obviously your book was worth reading because of that.